Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Universal Peace Federation's International Media Association for Peace monthly webinar on the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. My name is Ray LaPaukin, and I currently serve as the UPF Pittsburgh coordinator for IMAP, along with my colleagues Hans Moyer in Philadelphia and Pierre Beauregard in Montreal, Canada. The International Media Association for Peace recognizes the vital role that journalists play in guarding against totalitarianism and supporting the expansion of freedom. IMAP represents a worldwide professional network of journalists who support a socially responsible and moral media to convey accurate content, address the challenges of our time based on the highest principles of ethical journalism, while understanding that universal values are key elements for a world of peace. Our program today is titled China's Deeper Strategic Moves. And we have three excellent speakers with us today. And to introduce them is our moderator today, Dr. Michael Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins is president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast. He's also chairman of the Washington Times Holding, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He's led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to both Korea and Japan that have met with the legislative, executive, intelligence, and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has a decades-long involvement in starting and conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in Northeast Asia and the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Ray, thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to be with you. Our first speaker today is Mr. Guy Taylor. Guy is the national security team leader for the Washington Times. He is an award-winning foreign correspondent, currently overseeing the Times State Department and intelligence community coverage. Mr. Taylor has engaged in extensive international reporting over the past 20 years, including Latin America to the Middle East and the Asia Pacific. His exhaustive coverage of the U.S. policy towards North Korea and the crisis there has won accolades from across the political spectrum. His reporting on security, political, and economic developments in Mexico won the Virginia Press Association Award. His reporting on Russia's attempts to influence the 2016 election was recognized with the Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency. Welcome, Mr. Guy Taylor of the Washington Times. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. Thank you to the Universal Peace Federation. Thanks to the Washington Times. I'm frankly flattered to be here, and we've got really exciting discussion in front of us, and a couple of guests, including a senior journalist I work with, but then also a former high-level official, right? So we have guys coming after me that I think can dig even deeper into what we're going to get at here. And I want to offer some introductory sort of framing remarks about how about what's really going on with this sort of deeper strategic moves that Beijing is making now in the 21st century, but really have been building for almost 40 years at this point, but have really kind of accelerated in the last decade. And I think what the best way to do this is I want to talk about what are known as the sea lines of communication. This is a really broad term that kind of describes traffic that moves through this massive bodies of water that really define Asia. South Asia and East Asia are just so dominated by the Pacific. And through the sea lines of communication pass petroleum and really all of the goods that move between the United States, Europe, and Asia, from China to the rest of the world, and then increasingly from an area of West Africa called the Gulf of Guinea, which is incredibly important because this is right off of Nigeria. This is really one of the most dynamic fossil fuel markets in the world right now in terms of its growing. And it feeds right into these sea lines of communication that move right up through the islands of Southeast Asia, and then they move right up through the South China Sea And the reason I bring up these things, they're called S-locks in the sort of national security world, the intelligence world. And the S-locks happen to, at this point, this is like 70% of the goods moving in the global economy are going through these S-locks, not to mention all this fuel that moves from West Africa up to the Japanese market and into the South Korean market, but also to China. These are really, really important. And right in the middle of the S-locks actually run right through two island chains. And the island chains are what have made a little bit of headlines in the last 10 years. They're the Spratlys and the Paracels. And what you see, if you look at this from Beijing's perspective, is we want to control these S-locks. We want to control the sea lines of communication. So I'm going to pick it up there when I conclude in a minute. But before I do, I just want to offer a few more basic kind of key points as we think about what I'm sure that Bill is going to get into. And I think, you know, as we kind of really try to dig into what is the trajectory of China's deeper strategy stuff. Asia Pacific nations right now consume far more oil and gas than they produce. Okay, this is an important fact. And as a result, all of these Asians, the smaller nations, some aligned with the US, but also China, are increasingly engaged in what I describe or what I see as a kind of militarized quest for energy security. Will we continue to get that oil coming in from, whether it's West Africa, the United States? Is it coming from anywhere else in the world? Is it coming from the Middle East? I didn't mention the Persian Gulf. All of that moves through these S-locks. Energy imports to China, Japan, South Korea, they bring these vital Mideast and African tankers through the S-locks, right? So nations are vying for this influence over the S-locks, and control of the S-locks and these island chains. I mentioned the Spratlys and the Paracels. This has led to what really was the first kind of breakout move by the Chinese government that has sort of awakened the West to the possibility that China is not just this reformable, go-to, maybe global capitalist partner that this sort of American neoliberal establishment could work with and possibly reform. And what I'm talking about, it starts back with some moves in fights between Vietnam and China, and it goes back to the British colonial era and fights over the Paracels. But then all of a sudden, come 2013, 2014, and American intelligence becomes very aware that it looks like the Chinese military is building. It's building on reefs and the Spratlys and the Paracels. It's actually building man-made artificial islands so that it can have the biggest permanent, not just ships going through, but it can have these permanent military installations that are buttressed right on the north and south side of this S-lock that is the biggest trade route for global goods, that is absolutely vital to the economic survival of US allies and the US security architecture of democracy in that part of the world as well. And they're building these things on Woody, Fiery Cross, Mischief Reef, Subi Reef. There are a whole bunch of them, right? And what we've seen since 2014 is actually that the Chinese military has constructed 72 different fighter jet hangars at 3 different air bases in the Spratlys: Fiery Cross, Mischief, Chief, and Subi Reefs, right? And they've got another 16 of these hangars on Woody Island in the Paracels. So I bring this up because as we go from out to the rest of the world and China's sort of global ambitions, I think we have to consider that the United States is not building artificial islands or artificial military bases, miles and miles out to sea that become these permanent military structures. They can't just be pushed around or moved. Suddenly, these are permanent Chinese-controlled structures that have the potential to choke off, if it came to that, could potentially choke off an S-lock, or to control, to have the most influence over what ultimately flows through those S-locks, the sea lines of communication. So those are some really just broad initial ideas. Where we've gone since 2014, we're in a changed world. And it started right there. The last thing I'll say about any analysis of Chinese strategic ambitions, one of the most interesting things that I've kind of come across, and as I study this as a journalist, is look at the Chinese coastline. It's kind of boxed in. I mean, the United States we've got the West Coast on the Pacific, and we've got the East Coast on the Atlantic. We've got the South going into the southern part of the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese just have one coastline that opens there. So they want to build out from that coastline because that's how they can push into the rest of the world. I'm going to leave it there because I have some exciting comments for the Q&A, which hopefully we'll get to. And I don't want to encroach upon the expertise of my senior colleagues who come after me. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you for the clarification of the S-locks and such a serious challenge to the free world. The next speaker is Mr. Bill Gertz. He's a national security correspondent for the Washington Times, as well as the editor and publisher of the news site Flash Critic Cyber Threat News. He's author of 8 books. The one that I'm reading right now is called Deceiving the Sky. This is an excellent book. It's really like a very in-depth textbook to study each area of the China's development, from cyber threats to the whole challenge of diplomacy and propaganda and Huawei and all of it. It's just fascinating and also shocking. What's really shocking about his book is the way that the American leadership from various parts of our society has always believed, some of them believe very strongly, that if China really developed their prosperity, they would leave communism behind. Well, Bill will help shed some light on that. On January 4th, he wrote a very powerful article for the Washington Times. He writes every day, and this was on China and the Xi Jinping's message during the anniversary of the Chinese history. So I'd like to invite at this time Mr. Bill Gertz. Bill, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for that kind introduction. I'm going to very briefly go over what I call China's expansionism. But before I do that, I want to provide a little bit of background on how we got to the situation where we now see China's drive for global dominance and global supremacy. I've been covering the Pentagon since 1985 for the Washington Times, and I covered back then the publications known as Soviet military power, an annual assessment of the threat posed by the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Pentagon then began publishing something called the China Military Power Report. But it was much different. It was always a bone of contention among policy and intelligence officials over how to characterize communist China. And I can remember in those early reports, which were done primarily by the Defense Intelligence Agency, but massaged heavily by the policy community, both in the Pentagon and outside. And I can remember the Pentagon saying that China had no military ambitions beyond reaching out and retaking Taiwan. In other words, it was not a global threat. This turned out to be a huge, huge failure. And the reason for that is because of a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature and the character of the communist regime in China, in Beijing. And it's beginning to be realized now, more than 20, 30 years later, that China poses the most serious existential threat. And yet we still are debating over whether China is a threat. And I can tell you that the problem is a misunderstanding of the nature of the communist system. If you talk to people who lived in China under the communist regime, or lived in Russia or Eastern Europe under those communist systems there. They're very clear. They have a very clear understanding of what communism is, how it works, and its ideological motivations. Yet we in the West have really failed to capture this. I can remember so many times the intelligence community and the policy community insisting publicly that China posed no threat to the United States or to the West. Now we see that it does. And the reason that it does is because of communist ideology. It's Marxism-Leninism. It's a variety of Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics. And it is really the core issue. And yet, based on the really strong cultural aversion to anti-communism stemming from the McCarthy period in the 1950s, there's what I call anti-communist culture within government and society as a whole. And we need to overcome that and really understand the nature. A famous example was the article of George Kennan wrote, the famous Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs about it was called the sources of Soviet conduct. And what he identified as the sources of Soviet conduct was Marxism-Leninism. We need to do a similar assessment of China. It's beginning to be realized, but the sources of Chinese conduct, why is China expanding around the world, stem from its Marxist-Leninist ideology. I can tell you I've been in public debates with China experts who have insisted to me that China is no longer communist, and to which I say, please go visit the People's Liberation Army Museum in Beijing, which I did. If you go in that museum, you will see 30-foot statues of the founding fathers of communism, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao Zedong, Stalin. They're still there. And so the Chinese regime sees itself as locked in a death struggle with world capitalism led by the United States. This was one of the central messages of my book, Deceiving the Sky. And so if you don't understand that, then you just look at China as just simply another nation like France or Germany or the United States or like that. It's not. It's a communist system motivated by communist ideology. Now let's look at their ports facilities. Right now, China has established 95 port facilities that are run by state-owned companies. And the key to understanding this is that China is not like the United States. It has what is known as military civilian fusion. So everything that China does civilian-wise has an element of the military. They don't distinguish. The factories here in the United States, the factories that make refrigerators don't make missiles. In China, the factories that make refrigerators make missiles. They make space launchers and they make ICBMs, and so there's no distinction. They've dropped that distinction. We need to understand that clearly. The other thing I would emphasize, and this was in the piece that Michael mentioned about the containerized missile threat. China is developing what is known as a container missile. That is, it's a YJ-18 long-range cruise missile. And what makes this missile unique is it's modeled after the Russian Club K, which is a containerized cruise missile. It's put in a 40-foot shipping container. Of course, all of these ports have thousands and hundreds of thousands of these containers. What it means to have a containerized missile is that these port facilities, which again are ostensibly civilian in nature, can actually be turned into cruise missile bases. And I quoted in that piece a civilian US official who said that if there is a war with China, the opening segment will begin with China using these containerized missiles to take out key nodes of communication and other strikes. So this is a real threat, and it's something that needs to be looked at very carefully. I'll stop there, and hopefully I've triggered enough for some questions, and we can go forward in the question period for any elaboration that you like.
Oh, thank you, Bill. This is just great. Everybody's being so clear and concise that we're going to have a really good discussion. Our next speaker is Mr. James E. Fennell. former Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the Pacific Fleet. He actually retired from that post in 2015 with 30 years of a distinguished career. He also emphasized in his intelligence work the Chinese Navy and its operations. His most recent assignment was the Director of Intelligence and Information for the Pacific Fleet. So throughout his career, he served in a variety of afloat and ashore assignments across the Pacific region, highlighted by tours with the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, the U.S. 7th Fleet, and also working with every level of intelligence. He was a National Security Affairs Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and he studied Chinese, national political, and security affairs. He holds a BA in History and Political Science and a MA in History in the University of Hawaii, also MA from the Air Command and Staff College, MA in Military Science. James is a public speaker and well-known throughout the intelligence and military world. We welcome you, Mr. James Fennell. Welcome.
Dr. Jenkins, thank you for the invitation. I thank the Universal Peace Foundation and Washington Times Foundation for the kind invitation and the honor to speak with these two previous expert speakers. And it's a hard act to follow given some of the things that they've said. I think I'll start off with just touching up a bit on what Bill mentioned about the intelligence community where I worked for my entire career, and how there was this institutionalized resistance to warning about China. I came back from my first assignment on board the USS Kitty Hawk in Japan in 2005, and I came back to the Pentagon. I briefed some senior officers there and warned them that China was getting ready and preparing to reunify or take Taiwan, as they call it, reunify. It's not really a reunification because they've never had it before, but the People's Republic of China had designs and they were preparing for this. And I was told by some senior officers that if they were naval senior officers, that if they went across and told their Army or Air Force or Marine Corps counterparts that they'd get laughed out of the Pentagon. And so we spent 30 years, last year was the 30th anniversary of Desert Storm. And we spent the last 30 years as a nation focused on the Middle East and the war on terror. And we can debate that. But from my perspective of having been on the other side of the world, we neglected the rise of China. And it's not a peaceful rise, as they say. In 2013, 2014, I gave a couple of speeches in San Diego at the U.S. Naval Institute. And I talked about China's short, sharp war that they would use to take the Senkakus from Japan in conjunction with the Taiwan invasion. And that was ridiculed by many of the think tanks in Washington, D.C. In 2015, I wrote a paper that talked about the Chinese would have a 500-ship Navy in 2030, and that was criticized. In 2019, I was speaking again up at the Newport at the Naval War College and talked about the notion that China had global naval aspirations and that they were seeking maritime superiority by 2049 and or earlier. And that was, again, resistance there to this idea. So we've had 30 years of kind of an institutionalized resistance to this for most of the reasons that Bill outlined. And so that's been a little bit part of my frustration. But as an intelligence professional, my job is to continue to predict and call out warning into the future. And so what I've been trying to get across to people now is I think more and more people are recognizing that there is an inherent existential threat from the People's Republic of China and what it means to peace in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia and globally. But what we haven't really accepted is this idea that the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party are on a timeline. And we kind of also bifurcate leaders, paramount leaders. We look at Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi, and we kind of, it's popular in Washington today to say that Xi is an outlier, and that if we could just get rid of Xi, that things would be better, and we could go back to what I call the Kissinger School of Engagement, where we could just engage with China, talk with them, and everything would work out. And I'm here to submit that there has been no fundamental change in the outlook of the paramount leaders amongst the Chinese Communist Party, that they've just become more refined, and that now that Xi has power, both economically and militarily and diplomatically, that they're able to be much more aggressive than they had under Deng with his hide and bide strategy. And so what we see now is Xi has opened up his time as the leader, the great leader, he calls himself the helmsman of China, with the One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative that's expanded China's economic power around the globe. 2017, the Xinhua News reported that China actually, in addition to the Belt and Road, had 3 blue economic corridors. One would go through that South China Sea that Guy described, into the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean. Another one would go up through the Bering Sea and into the Arctic. And then the third economic corridor would go out into the South Pacific. And that's what we're seeing happen over these last 5 years since they told us that. And they've been developing that plan through their comprehensive national power for years before that. So the issue now before us is, what is China's design? And their design is for what Xi has described as the great rejuvenation of China, the great rejuvenation of the People's Republic of China, which is to restore, is to place China back in this position that they believe they deserve, which is to be the arbiter of all global decisions and economics and everything. The word you've probably heard Gordon Chang talk about, Qin Sha, all under heaven, so that they are the rulers of the universe, if you will. In the 1860s, in the Ming and Qing dynasties, the known universe that mattered for them at that time was in Asia, was around China, and the satellite nations that kowtowed to them. In 2022, the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party recognize that the world is a global world and that they're going to have to influence and control those global institutions, which is why you have the Belt and Road Initiative, why you have trains traveling from central China into Europe with goods, why you have the United Nations dominated by Chinese diplomats in positions of key authority, like we've seen the last 2 years in the World Health Organization. But the other part of it is territorial acquisition. And while China has, the Communist Party's design is to acquire all these things without firing a shot, like they did at Scarborough Shoal in 2012, where they seized Scarborough Shoal from the Republic of the Philippines, a US ally, treaty ally, defense ally. They took that territory from Taiwan without firing a shot. They built those 7 artificial islands, 3 of which are the size of Pearl Harbor. You don't hear that reported, that China built 3 Pearl Harbors in the South China Sea. They did all that without firing a shot, and they essentially acquired control of the South China Sea. Not absolute control, but they are there all the time. So when the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Carl Vinson that are operating there right now depart in a week and they go back home to the West Coast, the Chinese will still be there in force with those 3 major airfields and naval bases in the Spratlys. They'll be there with tens and tens of ships that are operating daily in the South China Sea. So then the last area that's really in dispute from their perspective, they've got control of Hong Kong now. They're pushing on India, which is another area that we could talk about. But the last big piece, and the one that's really most important to them, is Taiwan. And they're on a trajectory to take Taiwan, and it's not going to be in 100 years. They're on a timeline to take it so that by 2049, whoever is the leader of China, the People's Republic of China in 2049, on 1 October for their National Day, is going to stand up in front of the Forbidden City and say, we have been restored. We have completed the great rejuvenation that Comrade Xi told us about in 2022, and the great China dream has been achieved. And to do that, they're going to have to bring Taiwan to heel. And they prefer to not use military force, but they're prepared to use it. And so the question is, when are they going to use it? And I have, for the last 10 years, been saying that this decade, 2020 to 2030, are the most dangerous decade. We know that Hu Jintao and Xi ordered the PLA to be ready to take Taiwan in 2020 militarily. And in 2030 is probably the end time that they could use military force and expect the world to come back and go to a ceremony in Beijing in 2049. And so this 10-year period is very tenuous. And now we have the commander of US Pacific Command, the outgoing one, Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Davidson, last March say he thought it would be around 2027. Last October, the Minister of Defense from Taiwan said he thought it would be 2025, which is a remarkable statement from any Taiwan government official from either party. And so, and you have people now talking about, even Congressman McCall saying that it could come as early as right after the Beijing Olympics. And we are seeing, not just in diplomacy and rhetoric from the Chinese, we're also seeing it in their military operations. Just in the last couple of days, they've penetrated the Taiwan Air Defense Identification Zone with high numbers of fighter and bomber aircraft. Their naval patrols with carriers and ships are circumnavigating Taiwan. And so they've increased the pressure on Taiwan, and they're getting ready to do something, and we're not prepared for it. And that's my greatest concern. And then lastly, I think the last key element that I think has really changed in the last 6 to 8 months is the fact that for my career, when we talked about the PRC and the PLA, it was always in conventional terms. But in the last 6, 8 months, we've seen now commercial imagery that has shown 350 intercontinental ballistic missile silos being built out in central and western China. And so what I'm afraid of is that in 2012, Dr. Phil Carver gave a warning about the underground Great Wall, where he and his undergraduate and graduate students did an analysis that said there were thousands of kilometers of tunnels in China that were being developed to house ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. And now here we are 10 years later, and we're seeing China in 1 year build 350 silos. And they're seeking, I think, to have nuclear superiority over America. And no one in America's defense establishment is really talking about it. It's been reported, but it's not really driving the agenda. In my mind, this should be probably the #1 topic in American defense circles. And I think I'll close there.
Thank you, James. Excellent, excellent commentary. And we really want to go into some discussion. I'd like to bring all of our speakers on the screen so we can have a discussion. Thank you. First of all, for Guy Taylor, China has developed hypersonic missiles, and we now are, you wrote in the Washington Times about the several of the missile launches from North Korea and the perspective that they could be hypersonic. Which, can you tell us about that, Guy? What was concluded there?
Yeah, I think it's such a great question because one of the things I'm really focused on at the Washington Times, Dr. Jenkins, is trying to identify holes in the civil society conversation about American foreign policy or about global security. And one of the big holes in the American foreign policy civil society, so is outside of the clandestine intelligence community, is that there's really not a clear understanding of what the China-North Korea relationship is actually all about. What we hear about is, well, it's about coal, and there's coal moving between the two, and some trade, and they're trading partners. But the idea that there's actual really serious interplay between Chinese weapons developments and North Korean weapons developments, it's not fully understood. The other, at least in the public realm, the other thing that's not really understood is the extent to which China views North Korea strategically. I mean, what is the strategic benefit to China to have this kind of pariah state neighbor that's antagonizing this sort of rogue government that's antagonizing regional security and really global security, as well as the United States and its partners, especially, right? What is the benefit? We could go back and understand what the benefit of the Soviet Union was to have this relationship with North Korea. I mean, the North Korea-South Korea war really grew out of a Cold War conflict, the beginning of a Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But when we look at China, we really don't understand what that strategic relationship is between China and North Korea. And one place to start would be to compare the weapons developments coming out of North Korea right now, hypersonic missiles, and the weapons developments coming out of China in the last 10 years, hypersonic missiles. So that's really where I would leave that, is we need to pay more attention to that, especially when we've had a parade. I'll conclude on this one, just that we've had this parade of leaders in Washington and national security councils that do public diplomacy, talk to the media, and sort of create narratives about what's going on. And we've had several in a row now that have tried to tell us that, in fact, we can't solve the North Korea problem unless we get China on board. They're really our partner. When in reality, we should be asking whether that's even that's just a non-starter. I mean, if China was our partner, then let's get together and I know this is potentially sensitive and debatable, but let's get together and talk about how we're going to solve the North Korea problem, not watch as North Korea develops hypersonic missiles right after China and then scratch our heads on whether or not the two are working in tandem. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Bill, your book gives very in-depth treatment to some of the intelligence situations that occurred where some of key figures that had intel from within China. One was a deputy mayor who had the goods on Mr. Bo. And then also he was the one that actually came to one of our consulates and wanted to defect and wanted asylum. And our American government, our officials rejected it. Tell us about that a little bit. Why did we apparently that was a huge miss for our intel community.
Yes, this happened during the Obama administration, right before Xi Jinping ascended to become the supreme leader. And it had to do with a defector named Wang Lijun, who basically was the top communist official in Chengdu, China. It's one of the largest cities, and he was an aide to Bo Xilai, who was considered a rival for power to Xi Jinping, and so that triggered a major defection when this Wang Lijun came to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu, and basically was able to get in. He dressed up as a woman and brought documents with him, and he was eventually turned over to the Chinese. And Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, revealed in her book, Hard Choices, that she wanted to return the defector. They claimed that he had human rights abuses and therefore wasn't a valid defector. Of course, he would have been an extremely valuable source of information and intelligence on the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party. But instead, he was turned over to the Beijing authorities and imprisoned. He was probably executed. We haven't heard from him since then. This highlights what I have written about also in the book on the real intelligence paucity of information that the US government has. And this goes back to 2010, when, as a result of a combination of traitors within the CIA, as well as a compromise of communications used to communicate with recruited agents in China, the Chinese Ministry of State Security rolled up more than 24 of American recruited agents. And it's a huge scandal that has never really had, as Jim mentioned about the nuclear threat, has never really been discussed in public. There's never been reforms to try and fix the CIA, to try and get information. If we can't get inside the leadership compound in Beijing, known as Yongnan High, we'll never be able to fully understand China's goals and really be able to work against this regime. Again, conciliatory policies right up until the Trump administration precluded really conducting aggressive intelligence spying operations against China. In fact, it went the opposite way. It was, let's not spy on China, lest we upset this supposed close relationship, this economic relationship, which was supposed to be the tool that would reform the Chinese system. As I mentioned in the piece that Mike mentioned on Chinese bases, Jake Sullivan, who's now the National Security Advisor, before he became the National Security Advisor, he recognized in a piece that he co-wrote with another former official that the idea of bringing China into the world system to make it a, quote, responsible stakeholder in the world order was an utter failure, and that it was an entire strategic deception operation to think the West, if it traded with China, that it would somehow have a moderating influence. And in fact, now we've seen the emergence of a neo-Maoist China under Xi Jinping.
Your book also comments on the fact that Kurt Campbell said that we should take that defector in opposition to Jake Sullivan. So it's sad to see that we would miss such an opportunity, because you cover that very well, that he had things that could have compromised Xi Jinping.
Well, actually, it was Tony Blinken, who's currently the Secretary of State, and at the time was an aide to then Vice President Joe Biden, who was one of those who argued in the interagency that the United States should not attempt to try to get this defector out of the consulate in Chengdu. Of course, Tony Blinken denied that, but I have it on pretty good authority from sources within the US government that that was the case.
James, thank you, Bill. James, tell us about the Chinese Navy. You were on a program with us not too long ago. You were asked about the strength of the Chinese Navy. They talk about more ships than we have, and perhaps even more capability than our Navy. Can you touch on that a little bit? And then also, how does that square with our ability to defend Taiwan?
Yeah, right now the Chinese Navy is the largest Navy in the world by numbers of ships. And I know that many people say, well, numbers of ships isn't a good metric to measure navies, and I agree. There's a lot more that goes into that. Sometimes you can measure tonnage, and we like to talk about the tonnage of ships that we have, and we do have a lot of tonnage. But in the last 5-7 years, China has outproduced the U.S. in tonnage of ships, warships, over the last 5 to 7 years. They're producing big ships, to Type 075 amphibious assault helicopter carriers, the LHAs that are 40,000 tons. They've produced a refurbished aircraft carrier. They've got a second aircraft carrier that they built from scratch. They've got a third one that's getting ready to be launched, and a fourth one underway. And we're still having trouble with, getting the Ford, fully operational. So that's another measure. The one that really matters to me is the ability to project ordnance downrange. And in that sense, the Chinese have built their Navy to defeat another Navy at sea. And they've done that by putting on board these anti-ship cruise missiles. And they have the best anti-ship cruise missiles in the world right now. Bill mentioned the YJ-18. They have the YJ-12. These are missiles that have 400 to 500 kilometer range. They're supersonic missiles that fly three times the speed of sound, Mach 3. They have high-end maneuvers at the end game before they go in and strike an enemy ship, that they can maneuver with high degree of Gs, so they can pull a lot of Gs to defeat an in-close weapon system that our ships may have to try to shoot it down. So they're survivable. And they've put these on almost all of their frontline ships, from their smallest Type 022 Hubei catamaran ships all the way up to their latest, newest Type 055 Renhai class cruiser that's 13,000 tons. It's larger than anything that we have, and they have 112 VLS launch tubes to launch missiles like that. So their ships, their aircraft, their PLA Navy aircraft, and their submarines all have these anti-ship cruise missiles. And then they're combined with the strategic rocket force that has anti-ship ballistic missiles. And then you combine that with hypersonic missiles, and you start getting into this idea that we talk about, the A2AD, anti-access area denial capability. The Chinese call it counter-intervention. And so they built a fleet to be able to keep the US Navy and the US 7th Fleet from getting in close to Taiwan, and it's integrated. Now, we still have a lot of power and capability in our aircraft carriers. We have 2, as I mentioned earlier, operating in the South China Sea. But if you go back and look, in August of 2020, China fired a salvo of DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles, specifically designed to sink aircraft carriers. And they fired it at a maneuvering target in a closure area southeast of Hainan Island, and the target was moving. We saw here just a month or 2 ago in central China, an aircraft carrier mock-up the size of a US aircraft carrier on a rail line that the Chinese rocket forces are testing to hit it as it moves. So they haven't stopped their testing. I watched that testing when I was on active duty, going back 20 years, and they're continuing to develop it. And so they have a different kind of Navy than we do. And so when we don't see their Navy look exactly like ours, there's a tendency to say it's not as capable. The one area that we still have a large advantage in is in the submarine arena, in the undersea world. but China's been working on that diligently, putting in underground or underwater hydrographic buoys and sensors that will listen and find our submarines inside the South China Sea and also out from the first island chain from Okinawa to Guam. And so they're advancing in that arena. And so we can't rest on our laurels. And what that means, though, is if they can isolate and keep the US 7th Fleet away and the rest of the Pacific Fleet away from Taiwan, their chances of a successful invasion go dramatically up.
And how does that help us understand the threat to Taiwan?
It makes us realize that we're going to have to do something to give Taiwan the capability to effect that fleet. And that means they have to have more shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles. We need to have been helping the Taiwans get submarines years ago. The Trump administration's allowing the selling and transfer of technology for submarines was a huge step forward, but that should have been done a decade earlier when President Bush promised it. So they're behind the power curve, but they have, they can get mines, sea mines, they can have air-launched sea mines, shipborne sea mines, anti-ship cruise missiles, shore-based, just like China has. And then we need to talk about missiles that Taiwan can have and the Japanese islands can have that can actually range and not only sink Chinese surface combatants and aircraft, but also can take out targets on mainland China.
Yeah, and Mike, I would add too that there's been much debate now in Washington about helping Taiwan develop what we call asymmetric warfare capabilities. Obviously, they're outgunned by the PLA, but with proper assistance, they can find very niche capabilities that would really make a difference in going after the PLA.
Very good. Okay, I'd like to talk about two topics with our distinguished panel here. One is how do we counter this influence? We have the Quad relationship, which Ambassador Harry Harris and Admiral Harry Harris shared with us on our last Washington brief, is an informal relationship, but very important with Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. How does the Quad work to help shore up our allies and our relationships there to counterbalance China? No one predicts that US or China want to have a hot war in the Northeast Asia. So how do we work with our allies to counterbalance this influence with China, and how do we do that also with asymmetric means and also with the communication in terms of getting out the facts, like even hearing from James today. The American public should hear very clearly where we stand with the US Navy. Go ahead, Guy.
Sure. I actually think this is really interesting because you're tapping into the diplomatic realm and the sort of diplomatic instrument of power, which is a lot less sexy than missiles and intelligence per se, and sometimes just involves maintaining a focal point in relations with like-minded partners. What's interesting about the Quad is it's this thing that has been around since really the 2004 tsunami that rocked Southeast Asia, and Japan and the United States and India, Australia kind of banded together in an effort to bring aid to Indonesia, for instance, a couple other places, Thailand as well. The Quad now is this alignment of major democracies, Australia, the United States, Japan, India being the really big player. Because if we jump ahead on global projections of population and economic power, you see projections that the Chinese economy, the way it's going now, will surpass the size of the United States. And so will the Indian economy. And the US and India together can be a much greater and more influential global economy than just China. And they're like-minded. So this is really what the Quad is about, is bringing these like-minded, democratic, free market, pluralistic, free media governments and groupings of people, really, these governments together to kind of confront this idea of Chinese communist fueled autocracy or a group of men in a secret room writing the rules of the global economy, which is what everybody's afraid of with China as a rising global power. But what I want to say in conclusion on this, Dr. Jenkins, is look, the United States, it doesn't matter if it was the Trump administration, now the Biden administration, the United States, I think, needs to be more effective and collaborative between the legislative branch and the executive branch with organizations like the U.S.-China Commission, which Bill has written about recently in the Washington Times. We need more bipartisan focus on how to go out and have a sustained effort to bring those like-minded allies together to possibly collectively encourage smaller democracies that are out on the periphery of the Quad, and we could rattle off 15 of them across Asia, just Indonesia, the Philippines, to name a couple, Singapore. Get them to know that the Quad will help them stand up to Chinese economic coercion, right? And that discussion has got to become mainstream. There's got to be it's popped out a little bit and there's some awareness of it, but it's got to basically become an underpinning of what the American diplomatic strategy is, the public diplomatic strategy is in that part of the world and also around the world. And I think we're trying, but right now you've seen the Biden administration focus more on a narrative about getting cooperation from China on climate change. That is really important too, but I really think you've got to have this emphasis on, look, we're not going to let China bully smaller countries economically. And in my concluding remarks, I'll get into how that coercion really actually works.
Yeah, Mike, I'd like to add to that. I think
Bill, just go ahead, go right ahead.
yes, a subset of diplomacy is information warfare. Right now, the US media is fairly compromised when it comes to China. If you watch any of the news briefings at the State Department or the White House, almost never is the issue of the China threat raised. It's all about the Middle East or Russia or Europe and all these things. So there's a great reluctance on the part of the American media, and the US government has a failed system of information operations. We need to be able to tell the truth about communist China. That is the most significant thing that we can do to deal with this problem. It's through public education. And I think that this is something that is urgently needed. Telling the truth about China means telling about the genocide in Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs. It means telling the threats and what China is doing. The Biden administration has approached this problem of China as if it's a sports event. We're going to compete with China and we're going to say our democracy is better than their Marxism-Leninism. That's not going to be enough. We need a much more proactive approach. We need to create institutions that can, one, identify and counteract Chinese strategic disinformation and deception and propaganda. There's nothing out there. The Voice of America is billed itself as an NPR-like organization that's not really going to engage in these kinds of counter disinformation operations. So we urgently need something like that. Secondly, we need to focus on China's influence operations. And a model for this is Australia, which a number of years ago, an academic named Anne-Marie Brady did a landmark study of Chinese influence operations through a unit called the United Front Work Department. And that had a huge impact on Australia. They exposed a number of members of parliament who were secretly members of the Chinese military. They began restricting Chinese activities. Has there been a single think tank in the United States that has focused on Chinese influence operations in the same way that that was done a number of years ago? The answer is no, and we urgently need something like that.
James, thank you, Bill.
Yeah, I am in agreement with what Guy and Bill have said. I think that we lack, for a better term of it, we still lack this idea that we're declaring to ourselves that we recognize that China is an existential threat to us. If you're having Thanksgiving dinner in your house and you live in a suburban neighborhood and you see a man running down the street with an axe, swinging the axe, and he's coming up your driveway and it looks like he's going to bash down your door with this axe, you're probably going to act a little bit different than you act if you just see him walking down the street with his pet dog. And I think we sometimes look at China as that they're just this benign other country, and we don't realize that they're actually coming for us, and that they, in their own writings and their own discussions, talk about, I win, you die. That's the way they view this. And Bill mentioned that it's a struggle for life and death. And it doesn't mean it's going to be a thermonuclear war, as we have some people say. And that's part of the problem with this engagement school is it's either we engage or the alternative, we're told, is thermonuclear war. And there's a lot of steps and gray areas in between there that we can be very effective to deter China. The Quad, the AUKUS deal that was just announced, these are elements that can help us get there. But we got to work much faster than we have been working. And I'm afraid that where my focus now is on the operational and tactical arenas, or how are the Japanese Navy and the Taiwan Navy and the US Pacific Fleet actually operating together on a daily basis. You know, the National Defense Authorization Act, authorized that Taiwan could be invited to Rim of the Pacific exercise. Well, we invited the Chinese in 2012, and here we are 10 years later, and we still haven't formally invited Taiwan. I'm at the opinion that we should be actually holding RIMPAC in Taiwan and have all the other rest of our coalition Navy partners come to Taiwan, and we run the exercise out of Taiwan or something like that, where we're in the theater and we're showing the PRC that our navies can actually operate together and present a robust deterrent to their thinking in that regard. Lastly, I'd say, this is outside the military arena, but we're funding, and we have been funding, the development of this PRC, PLA military rise. And when I read about Larry Fink and BlackRock and the trillions of dollars that he has under his control, and people like him and Ray Dalio and others that are saying to continue to invest in China because it's a safe and secure market, it makes me angry, because every dollar that gets invested in China turns around, and some portion of that, a high portion, comes back and is used to build an anti-ship cruise missile that's going to kill shipmates and friends of mine on ships and submarines and aircraft and Marines and soldiers in our military. And eventually they'll have missiles like these hypersonic missiles that can reach us and reach our own shores and can affect and kill regular American citizens. And we seem to have forgotten that when we put dollars in their pocket, it's turning around and coming right back at us. And we've got to get that under control. It's out of control. And that means there's going to have to be a significant debate over what it means to be a free market capitalist, which I am, and what it means to be able to say, but in this regard, you can't spend money over there because they'll use it to kill us. We have to have that discussion.
I think thank you, James. A challenging point for the American people is the lack of understanding of how the Chinese government, the communist government, is operating on the Marxist-Leninist ideology, and that there's a purpose. So, Bill, your book brings out the fact that when Miles Kwok was invited to speak at the Hudson Institute, that got totally compromised by people of influence that used every kinds of means, not just warfare, but propaganda, influence, money, every kind of threats of losing your investment, everything, your exposure. And Guy, you've been reporting on this influence for years. How do we counter that ideology? How does that ideology, that commitment, people don't realize that commitment is almost like a faith. It's like they believe in what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They believe that America is not the friend, but an enemy that they want to undermine. So how do we counter that with information, Guy and Bill? And
the concluding thought that I have on this is that the United States cognoscenti, if you would, on global security needs to awaken to the reality that China already is a global power. This and has been so for several years now. When we look at something, and we need to identify that, and we need to play the same game that they're playing, but better and more effectively. We have to look at something like Belt and Road Initiative and we had to understand what is it. It's in some ways torn out of the pages of America's own rise to influence in the post-World War II era. It involves doling out loans to poorer nations. And in the Chinese case, it involves development loans that go to these nations. And then a couple of years later, Beijing comes along and says, hey, we realize that you actually have no capacity to pay back this loan. So I'll tell you what, you don't have to pay us back. We'll relieve your debt on the condition that you give us control of XYZ port or precious metal mine or oil well. So this is a kind of predatory lending. And the most sinister way of looking at it is that the Belt and Road Initiative is a ruse through which China is building a global network of military bases. A more benign way of framing it would be to call it the first serious global exertion of the Chinese economic instrument of power. What we see with the development of Chinese bases in the Spratlys, the Paracels, this is really the expression of Chinese military instrument of power. The increased fighter jet sorties threatening Taiwan, the Chinese naval buildup, all expressions of the Chinese military instrument of power. We see the diplomatic instrument at play with this dance to try and place Chinese officials atop every multinational organization in the world, especially at the United Nations, whether it's a multilateral ASEAN, it doesn't matter. The Chinese are trying diplomatically to control as many of these organizations as possible. And this is where I'll conclude, is the world needs to be more concerned about how the Chinese government intends over the coming years to exert the much more elusive informational instrument of power, be it in the cyber realm or in the futuristic artificial intelligence or AI realm. This is really not being discussed because the informational instrument of power is the one that intersects right into the defense, security, weapons development areas. And really what this comes down to especially is ensuring that it's not a very closed communist government, secretive in Beijing, that is left to write the global standards for how AI should and shouldn't be used upon the human species over the coming decades. I'm going to leave it just at that.
We need another hour. This is really great. Bill, any comments on how we counter this?
Yes.
This misinformation, propaganda, warfare?
Yes, it's extremely important, as I said, to tell the truth about China. That requires understanding the Chinese Communist Party's use of the big lie. And they are very expert at it. They use it strategically. They will tell you there's no human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. They'll tell you that they haven't given missile technology to North Korea. And this has been a huge problem. I go back to the Reagan administration back in the 80s when the Soviet Union shot down a commercial airliner. The Reagan administration released, I think probably for the first time, classified intercepts of the Soviet pilot ordering the destruction of the aircraft. We need to do a similar kind of thing here. Where is the US government not filming, providing satellite photos of the death camps in Xinjiang? Why doesn't the US military release photos and information about the Chinese military and what they're doing and how they're taking over islands? They leave it up to commercial groups to do it. This is the key. Again, telling the truth about China, I think, is ultimately going to help. And every person, you need to educate yourself to the China threat, and you need to educate our political leaders about that as well. James,
any insight on this? How do we counter this misinformation and misunderstanding of China in terms of the communist nation that it is and the threat it poses?
I agree with everything that Guy and Bill said. Those are the foundational elements, and we need to have it from the top down. We need to have a White House that's declaring that this is an existential threat, and it needs to be permeated across the government. That needs to happen. And so we saw a bit of a shift from the last administration that declared China was a strategic competitor, and now we're talking in our interim national security guidance about cooperation again. And so this is worrisome to me. And we that are on the outside have a responsibility to educate people in every forum that we talk to. And I can see by a lot of the the folks on the list and the gray beards on my face that some of us are all of a certain age group, and we really need to get down and talk to the people in a younger age group. I had a privilege yesterday of speaking to some university students on a forum like this. And that's where we really need to get to, is explain this, because when you point out some of the basic facts, these young kids are not stupid. They just haven't had the exposure. And so we need to expose them to what's going on, and then roll in the things that Bill and Guy have talked about, and make this something that really gets to them, to let them understand that things aren't always going to be the same way that they are. And they could get a lot worse than they've been in the last 2 years, a lot worse. Time is running out.
Finally, one question for each of you, just a brief concluding remark. What is the greatest weakness of China, the communist China? And I want to make it clear to our audience, we respect the Chinese people. We pray for their freedom. We want them to join the community of nations as a free nation. And we also recognize that we've got to understand, what is the weakness of China? There must be some Achilles heel somewhere.
I mean, I will just go first with this, because I think this is obviously really debatable. And but what I always hearken to when people ask me about the United States and what's the greatest strength of the United States, or also a real weakness, and what we make it a strength, is the diversity of the United States. And I think in the diversity of opinions, the pluralism in the government. I think if we were trying to identify China's weakness, from my perspective, it has to do with homogeneity in the society, immense amount of homogeneity, and a government that absolutely lacks tolerance for political pluralism or religious pluralism. And these are the things that really, I think, undergird America's standing as a power in the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, from my perspective, the greatest vulnerability and weakness is the Chinese Communist Party's illegitimate rule over China. The Chinese people do not want to be ruled under a communist system. They've tasted freedom. The ones that have come to the US, the ones that have been able to gain access to the internet, they do not want to live under a totalitarian, authoritarian system. And I think that I was urging the Trump administration to do this, was to create a white paper on the crimes of the Chinese Communist Party. It's actually kind of a corrupt, mafia-like system that has 95 million members, and it's not China. And the Trump administration, for the first time, began to distinguish between the ruling Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. And I think we need to build on that. We need to expose the real crimes of the Chinese Communist Party.
Excellent. James?
Yeah, there's no question the Chinese Communist Party is the ideological weakness of their system. But that party controls the PLA. And so we have this discussion in forums that I'm on a lot. We talk about what's the center of gravity for the PRC. And people say it's the party, and I don't disagree with that in a certain sense, but it's the military, and we have to be able to blunt that military and deter that military, and that's going to take a lot of work. And they have a lot of demographic vulnerabilities: aging population, limited access to energy, limited access to their own food supply. So if we wanted to get really serious and play real hardball to bring the party to its knees beyond the informational things that we've discussed, there's ways that we could really do that. And it would have severe impacts on the global economy and our own economy and people. If you think 100 ships waiting off the port of Long Beach is a bad thing, what happens if there were no ships that came there for a while? Who could survive the longest? But that is a surefire way to put the Chinese Communist Party in a headlock and make them squirm, because there's only 93 million of them compared to 1.4 million population, 1.4 billion population.
Well, we can't thank our distinguished panel enough. This has been an outstanding forum and has given us many ideas for having forums with students and young leaders. We can do that, and we'll have you back soon. We need to pursue this. And thank you so much. And thank you to our audience. We went a little over time, but I think it was well worth our time. We want to thank you very much, and we're on every Tuesday at 2 p.m.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.